camping under the stars can feel like the ultimate escape, leaving behind the noise of everyday life for the quiet embrace of nature. But what happens when the wilderness isn't as empty as it seems? Tonight, we're diving into 6 of the most disturbing true horror stories, experienced by people who dared to venture into the great outdoors. These tales will make you think twice before venturing into the woods ever again. Let's delve straight into this first disturbing story. I'd always been drawn to the idea of being alone in nature, away from everything, away from the constant distractions of modern life. Just me, the trees, the fresh air, and the silence. The kind of deep, unbroken silence you can never really find in the city. The kind that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound, every rustle in the bushes, every shift in the wind. But I wasn't thinking about that yet. I was just excited to finally have a weekend to myself, a chance to unplug, to clear my head, to feel that sense of freedom again that I hadn't felt in years. So I packed my gear, loaded up my car, and drove deep into the woods, farther than I'd ever gone before. The drive was beautiful, the kind that makes you feel like you're entering another world. Endless trees stretching up on either side of the road, golden sunlight filtering through the branches, flickering across my windshield as I wound my way deeper and deeper into the forest. And by the time I reached the trailhead, the afternoon light was already beginning to soften, the shadows growing longer, the air taking on that crisp, damp scent that always comes just before nightfall. And as I pulled into the small gravel lot, I felt a flicker of satisfaction when I saw that mine was the only car there. No one else. No other hikers, no campers. Just me, alone, exactly the way I wanted it. The trail was rougher than I expected, overgrown in places, branches reaching out like skeletal fingers to snag at my sleeves. The underbrush thick and tangled. But I didn't mind. It only made it feel more remote, more untouched. And after about an hour of hiking, I found the perfect spot. A small clearing nestled right beside a gently running creek. The kind of place you see on postcards, with moss-covered rocks and towering trees that swayed gently in the breeze. And as I set my pack down and started setting up my tent, I felt it for the first time. That strange, creeping sensation. Like the air had shifted, like something had changed. But when I paused and glanced around, the forest was still. Nothing but trees and fading sunlight and the distant murmur of the water. I shook it off, told myself I was just being paranoid, just adjusting to the isolation. But then, just as I was securing the last tent pole, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching over dry leaves. Slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere just beyond the tree line. And before I could even turn to look, a voice called out. Casual, too casual, like it had been waiting for the right moment to make itself known. Need a hand with that? I froze. I hadn't seen anyone on the trail, hadn't heard another soul for miles, and yet, standing there at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the trees, was a man. Tall, unshaven, wearing a faded flannel and muddy boots, a hunting knife strapped to his belt. And even though he was smiling, there was something about him that made my skin crawl. Something about the way he was just standing there, watching me, like he'd been there for a while. I forced myself to stay calm, to act normal, to not let him see how much his sudden presence had unsettled me, and I kept my voice light as I told him I was fine, that I had everything under control. But he didn't move, didn't leave, just stood there, eyes scanning over my gear, over my tent, then over me, like he was taking inventory, like he was deciding something. And then he asked the question that made my stomach drop. You out here alone? I don't know why I hadn't expected him to ask that, why I hadn't been prepared for it. But the way he said it, the way his head tilted just slightly to the side as he waited for my answer, sent a ripple of cold unease down my spine. And before I even had time to think, the words were already out of my mouth. A lie so automatic I almost believed it myself. "No, my boyfriend's just up the trail. He'll be back any minute." Something in his face shifted then, so subtle I almost missed it, like he didn't quite believe me, like he knew I was lying. But he just nodded, that same too casual smile still fixed on his face, and after a long, tense pause, he finally took a step back, shrugged, muttered something about how the forest can get lonely at night, and then he turned and disappeared into the trees. I stood there for a long time, heart hammering, ears straining for any sign of movement, but the forest had gone quiet again. Too quiet. And even as I forced myself to shake it off, to finish setting up camp, to light a fire, and eat my dinner like everything was normal, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that somewhere, hidden in the darkness just beyond the firelight, he was still there, watching. That night, I barely slept. I kept the flashlight within arm's reach, kept the camping knife beside me in my sleeping bag, kept my ears trained on every tiny sound outside the thin walls of my tent. But at some point, exhaustion must have won out, because the next thing I remember was snapping awake to the sound of something moving just outside. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer nosing through my campsite. But then I heard it again, the unmistakable, deliberate shuffle of footsteps circling around the tent. Slow, dragging, like whoever it was wanted me to hear them, wanted me to know they were there. I didn't move, didn't even breathe, just lay there, heart pounding in my throat, gripping the handle of my knife so tight my fingers ached. And then, just as I was working up the courage to say something, to make a sound, a shadow passed across the thin fabric of my tent. It was tall, human, and it was standing just inches away. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed, staring at that shifting silhouette. But eventually, after what felt like hours, the footsteps started up again, moving away this time, fading slowly into the trees. And even then, I didn't dare move, didn't dare unzip the tent, didn't dare do anything but wait for the first light of dawn. And when the sun finally started creeping through the trees, when I finally gathered the courage to step outside, my stomach dropped. The fire I had put out the night before had been relit, and in the dirt, right beside it, someone had scratched a single word: leave. I didn't stop to pack my things, didn't stop to eat, didn't stop to do anything but grab my essentials, shove them into my bag, and bolt down the trail as fast as my legs would carry me. And the entire time, as I stumbled through the underbrush, gasping for breath, I felt it. That same terrible, crawling sensation that I wasn't alone, that I was still being watched. And even when I finally reached my car, even when I locked the doors and peeled out of that empty lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been out there that night, whoever had stood inches away from my tent, wasn't just some random stranger. They had been waiting for me, and I don't think they wanted me to leave. I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. It was supposed to be a weekend of adventure, a chance to escape the noise, the stress, the endless routine of everyday life. Just me and Matt, deep in the wilderness, no marked trails, no signs of civilization, just the two of us, and the vast, untouched forest stretching for miles in every direction. The kind of place where the world feels ancient, where time slows down, where nothing exists except the sound of the wind through the trees and the distant murmur of a stream cutting through the landscape like a silver ribbon. We had been planning the trip for months, talking about it every time life started to feel suffocating, promising ourselves that as soon as we found the time, we'd do it right. No half measures, no easy campsites with picnic tables and fire pits, just raw, wild nature, The kind that makes you feel small in the best possible way. And finally, after too many delays, we made it happen. Drove for hours down winding back roads until pavement turned to gravel, then gravel to dirt. And finally, when the road became little more than an overgrown trail barely wide enough for the car, we stopped, grabbed our packs, and hiked deep into the woods. Farther than we should have gone. Farther than was safe. The clearing we found was perfect, secluded, quiet, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to swallow the last light of the day. A small stream nearby, cold and clear, the kind of place that felt untouched, undisturbed, exactly what we had been looking for. And as we set up the tent and built a small fire, the air crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth. I felt it for the first time. That strange, crawling sensation, like something just beyond my line of sight had shifted. Like the forest wasn't as empty as we thought it was. But I pushed the feeling aside, told myself it was just my mind adjusting to the isolation, the quiet, the overwhelming stillness of the place. Then we heard it. A footstep. Not the careless rustling of an animal moving through the underbrush, but something heavier, deliberate. The unmistakable sound of a boot pressing down on dry leaves, and without a word, Matt and I both went still. The easy conversation dying on our tongues. Every muscle in my body suddenly tense as we listened, waited, hoping it was nothing. Just the woods settling, the trees shifting in the wind. But then the sound came again, closer this time, and before we could react, a figure stepped out of the darkness. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a heavy jacket and worn boots, a man who looked like he belonged in a place like this, like he had been out here for a long time, maybe forever. His face half hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. But none of that was what made my stomach drop. It was the rifle slung over his shoulder, the way it sat there like an afterthought. Casual, easy, like it was something he was used to carrying, like it was something he had used before. He didn't speak right away, just stood there at the edge of our camp, watching, his presence pressing down on the space between us like something solid, like something tangible, and for a moment, all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat, too loud, too fast, hammering in my ears as I forced myself to stay still. Still, to keep my expression neutral, to pretend like I wasn't already calculating the distance back to the trail, back to the car, back to anywhere but here. Then, finally, he broke the silence. He told us we were on private property, that we weren't supposed to be here, that we needed to leave, and even though we hadn't seen any signs, hadn't passed any fences or markers, I knew arguing would be a mistake. Knew that whatever the truth was didn't matter, because we were too far from help, too deep into the woods, too isolated to take any chances. So I nodded, apologized, told him we didn't mean any trouble, that we would pack up and go. And for a long moment, he didn't respond, just stared at us, his eyes unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. Then finally, slowly, he gave a small nod. But something about the way he was standing, the way he wasn't moving, wasn't turning to leave, made my stomach twist, made my pulse spike, because even though he had gotten what he wanted, even though we were doing exactly as he said, it didn't feel like we were safe yet. We moved fast, shoving our sleeping bags into our packs, tearing down the tent with shaking hands, dousing the fire so quickly that smoke still curled up from the wet embers as we turned to leave. And the entire time, the man just stood there, silent, unmoving, his hand resting on the butt of his rifle, his presence stretching over us like a shadow, and every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to bolt down the trail and never look back. But I knew better. Knew that sudden movement could turn a bad situation into something much worse. So I forced myself to breathe, to keep my steps even, to keep my hands steady as I hoisted my pack onto my shoulders and started walking. The trail felt longer on the way back, darker, narrower, the trees pressing in from either side. And even though I wanted to believe we were in the clear, that the worst was over, I could still feel him, that heavy, suffocating presence lingering behind us. And when Matt leaned in just enough to whisper, I already knew what he was going to say before the words even left his mouth. He was following us. I didn't look right away, didn't want to make it obvious, didn't want him to know that we knew. But when I finally dared to glance over my shoulder, my stomach twisted into a cold knot of fear. Because there he was, about 50 feet behind us, his rifle no longer resting against his shoulder, now held in both hands. His steps slow, deliberate, like he wasn't just making sure we left, like he was waiting for something, like he was deciding. The sun had set completely by then, the only light coming from our flashlights, the beams cutting through the darkness like thin, fragile threads. And even though my entire body was screaming at me to run, I knew we couldn't. Not yet. Not while he was still so close. So we kept walking, our movements careful, controlled, forcing ourselves to stay calm, to keep the panic at bay. But then, he told us to stop. I don't know how I managed to turn around, how I kept my hands from shaking, how I forced myself to meet his gaze as he told us to drop our packs, as he took a step closer, as he tilted his head just slightly, like he was waiting to see how much further he could push, how much fear he could pull from us before we broke. Then, somewhere in the distance, a sound. Low. Distant. A howl. His head snapped up, his grip tightening on the rifle, his entire stance shifting just slightly, and for the first time since he had appeared, I saw it. Uncertainty. Another howl. Closer this time. He muttered something under his breath, his eyes darting toward the trees, his fingers flexing around the rifle like he was debating what to do. And then, just like that, the moment passed. He told us to stay put, turned, and disappeared into the woods, his footsteps fading into the darkness. The second he was gone, Matt grabbed my arm. We ran. We didn't stop until we reached the car, didn't stop until we were miles away, didn't stop until we were sure, absolutely sure, that we weren't being followed anymore. We never talked about it after that night, but we never went back, and we never will. The woods had always felt safe to me, a place of quiet, of solitude, of escape. That was why I came here, why I drove hours away from the nearest town, parked my truck at the end of a dirt road barely visible on any map, and hiked deep into the forest where no one else went, where the trees stretched endlessly in every direction, where the only sounds were the distant rustling of leaves, the chirp of crickets, the slow, steady breathing of the night. I had done this trip a dozen times before, always alone, always without worry, setting up camp in whatever clearing felt right, building a fire, letting the silence settle in my bones like a familiar weight. That night was no different, at first. The tent was warm. The fire outside had burned down to glowing embers. The air carried that crisp autumn bite that made the sleeping bag feel even more comfortable. And as I lay there, staring at the nylon ceiling, the exhaustion of the long hike started to drag me under, my thoughts growing sluggish, my body sinking deeper into the comfort of the dark. My phone buzzed once on the floor beside me, and for a second, I considered ignoring it, letting it wait until morning, but habit took over, and I reached for it, the screen illuminating the tent in a dull, pale glow. Unknown number. Nice spot you picked. The words didn't register at first, my sleep-addled brain struggling to make sense of them, scrolling up, searching for a previous conversation that didn't exist. My stomach twisted as I stared at the message, my fingers hovering over the screen, unsure whether to respond, unsure whether I even wanted to. My phone buzzed again. Unknown number. You always camp alone? The air inside the tent felt thinner, pressing against my ribs, my breath suddenly too loud, too sharp. Slowly, I sat up, listening, straining to hear something beyond the normal hum of the forest, beyond the distant whisper of wind through the trees. Nothing. I typed back, my fingers unsteady, my pulse hammering. Me. Who is this? Seconds passed. Then, unknown number. Thought you would have seen me by now. A cold electric pulse shot down my spine, my eyes darting to the thin fabric of the tent, searching for shadows, for movement, for anything. My hand moved instinctively to the knife tucked beside my sleeping bag, fingers wrapping tightly around the handle, every muscle tensed, every part of me listening, waiting. Another buzz. Unknown number. Don't worry, I'm not far. The world outside the tent had gone silent. No crickets, no wind, just stillness. With my free hand, I reached for the flashlight, flicking it on. The tent walls glowing faintly, but I knew the light wouldn't show me anything, wouldn't reveal whatever was out there, whoever was out there, watching. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to type, forcing myself to keep my hands steady. Me. If this is a joke, it's not funny. The reply came almost instantly. Unknown number. Who said I was joking? A branch snapped somewhere outside. Close. The sound shot through me like a jolt of electricity, my body frozen in place, the grip on my knife tightening, my breathing shallow, controlled, every part of me focused on the space just beyond the tent, the thin barrier between me and whatever was standing out there in the dark. Another message. Unknown. Number. Maybe you should step outside. I stayed still, waited, listened. Then, something moved just outside the tent. Slow, deliberate footsteps pressing into the dirt, circling, closer than I wanted to believe, closer than I could handle. I clenched my teeth, my mind racing through possibilities, through scenarios, through exits. But there weren't any. Not really. Just the zipper, just the fabric, just me inside and something else outside. Another buzz. Unknown number. Last chance. Then the footsteps stopped. The silence stretched, growing thicker, heavier, unbearable, and I could feel it. Feel the weight of something unseen pressing against the tent. Feel the presence lingering just beyond the light. And then, a shadow. A shape moving just beyond the thin fabric. A figure standing inches away, tall, unmoving, silent. I gripped the knife tighter, my heartbeat hammering in my throat, waiting for the next message, waiting for the next move, waiting for something, anything. But nothing came. No more buzzing, no more movement. Just that shape, that presence, waiting. And then, the gunshot. A deafening crack split through the night, shattering the silence, the tent lighting up for a fraction of a second as the muzzle flash illuminated the dark. My body reacted before my mind did, flattening against the ground, my ears ringing, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. Another shot, closer this time, the sound ricocheting through the trees. And then the footsteps started again, running, retreating, disappearing into the woods. I stayed there, breathless, motionless, my grip on the knife unrelenting, waiting for the next shot, for the next sound, for something. But nothing came. Minutes passed. Then, an hour. The forest slowly came back to life. The distant hum of crickets returning. The wind rustling softly through the trees, as if nothing had happened, as if nothing had ever been wrong. But I knew better. When I finally found the courage to move, to crawl toward the tent's zipper and peel it open, just enough to look outside. The campsite was empty, the fire reduced to little more than embers, the trees stretching tall and undisturbed. My hands shook as I scanned the clearing, searching for footprints, for evidence, for any sign that I hadn't imagined at all. And then I saw it. A single bullet casing. It sat in the dirt just a few feet from the tent, gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Proof that someone else had been here. Proof that someone else had been watching. and beside it, a phone. Face down in the dirt, screen cracked. The same unknown number still glowing in the dim light. One final message lingering unread. I reached for it, hesitated, then turned it over. Unknown number. See you soon. I didn't pack. I didn't wait for morning. I grabbed my keys, my bag, and I ran. By the time I reached my truck, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition, the thought pressing in on me, suffocating, undeniable. Whoever had sent those messages, whoever had been standing outside my tent, whoever had fired those shots, they hadn't missed. They had been aiming at something else. Something still out there in the dark. The lake was perfect, untouched, hidden deep within the forest where the trees grew thick and the world felt endless. A place so far removed from everything that it almost felt unreal. The kind of place where time moved slower, where silence stretched for miles, unbroken except for the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant call of a nightbird. Ryan and I had spent weeks planning this trip, searching for the perfect spot, somewhere secluded, somewhere quiet, somewhere that felt like ours. And when we finally found it, a small rise overlooking the water, just high enough to give us a clear view of the lake, but still nestled safely within the trees. It felt like the kind of place where nothing bad could ever happen. The kind of place where the world itself seemed to hold its breath. As the sun dipped lower, the sky turned to fire, streaks of red and gold bleeding into deep violet, and the air cooled with the coming night, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. We sat by the fire, hands entwined, talking in the slow, meandering way that only happens when time doesn't feel real, when the world beyond the trees doesn't exist, when all that matters is the sound of flames crackling, the soft lap of water against the shore, the warmth of another person beside you. The sky darkened, stars blooming against the inky black, and as the fire burned low, we crawled into the tent, zipping ourselves into our sleeping bags, the stillness of the lake wrapping around us like a second skin, pulling me toward sleep so easily that I barely remembered closing my eyes. Then the footsteps came. At first, they were distant, so faint that they barely registered, little more than the imagined shifting of branches, the natural settling of the forest. But as the moments passed, the sound grew clearer, more deliberate, slow and rhythmic, circling just beyond the thin fabric of the tent. My eyes snapped open, and in that instant, I knew, before I could even process what I was hearing, before I could even begin to move, I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that we were not alone. The sound continued, weaving through the trees, crunching over leaves and twigs, heavy, deliberate, too slow to be an animal, too measured to be anything but something aware, something watching. The air inside the tent had gone thick, heavy, pressing down on my chest like a weight I couldn't shake, and I stayed frozen, barely breathing, listening, waiting, every muscle locked in place as if movement itself might make me known. Then, just outside, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse. The kind of silence that wasn't empty, the kind that was waiting, stretching longer and longer, thick with something unseen, something patient. A shadow passed across the tent, a shift in the fabric so subtle it could have been imagined, but I knew better. I felt it, that sensation of something leaning close, something listening, something that knew I was awake. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound retreated, fading into the trees, vanishing into the thick, unbroken dark beyond the fire's dying glow. Sleep never came again. By the time I finally dared to move, the fire outside had shrunk to little more than embers, the glow barely strong enough to illuminate the inside of the tent, and the only sound was the steady rhythm of the lake against the shore. Slow, methodical, the same as it had always been. But something was different. Something had changed. I rolled onto my side, trying to shake the unease that had burrowed deep into my chest. But then my gaze drifted toward the lake, past the open flap of the tent, past the last glow of the fire, and my breath caught in my throat. A figure stood at the water's edge. Tall, unmoving, its back to the lake, facing the tent, standing so impossibly still that for a moment, I wasn't sure if my mind was playing tricks on me, if it was nothing more than a trick of the moonlight, the bend of a tree, the warped silhouette of some forgotten piece of driftwood. But the longer I stared, the more I knew. It was watching. It didn't move, didn't shift, didn't even breathe, just stood there, silent, expressionless, its presence pressing into the night like something tangible, something suffocating. The seconds stretched, dragging on, and every instinct inside me screamed to move, to run, to break the unnatural stillness that had taken hold of the world. But I couldn't. I just lay there, staring, trapped in the weight of its gaze. Then, slowly, deliberately, it turned. It didn't step away from the shore, didn't vanish back into the trees. It walked into the water. Not along the shoreline, not into the shallows where the sand sloped gently beneath the surface, but straight ahead, moving with slow, unbroken steps, the water parting around it, rising higher and higher, swallowing its legs, its waist, its chest. And still, it never stopped, never hesitated, never turned away, just kept walking until the last thing I saw was the top of its head slipping beneath the surface, until the water rippled once, then stilled. The lake was silent again. The forest remained still. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. And yet, the world no longer felt the same. I lay there, unable to blink, unable to breathe, waiting for something, anything, for the figure to return, for the water to shift, for proof that what I had seen was real. But nothing happened. Nothing broke the illusion of normalcy except for the lingering weight of something unseen, something that had been there, something that had left no trace except the undeniable sense that it was still watching. When dawn finally broke, the world outside was bathed in cold, pale light, the lake shimmering as if it had never known the weight of something unnatural. But I knew better. I felt it, that lingering unease pressing against my skin as I stepped outside the tent, as I walked toward the water's edge, drawn forward by something I didn't understand, something I didn't want to understand. The ground was soft beneath my feet, damp with the remnants of night. But as I reached the shoreline, my stomach turned. A single boot lay half buried in the mud. Old, battered, soaked through with lake water. The kind of thing that had no business being here. The kind of thing that should have rotted away years ago. And beside it, deep impressions in the earth. Footprints. Massive. Inhuman. Pressed into the ground so sharply they looked burned into it. They led to the water. But they never came back out. Neither of us spoke as we packed up the campsite, as we loaded the car, as we drove away, leaving the forest and the still silent lake behind us. Neither of us looked back, and neither of us ever returned. When Olivia invited us to spend the weekend on her dad's estate, it felt like the perfect way to end the summer. A last adventure before reality pulled us back into routines, responsibilities, the dull weight of normal life. The property stretched for miles, acres of rolling fields, dense woods, and an old barn that hadn't been touched in years, the kind of place where you could scream and no one would hear you. But at the time, that thought felt more like a joke than a warning. We pitched our tent near the tree line, far enough from the main house to feel like we were on our own, but close enough that, if we needed to, we could run back, though none of us admitted we were thinking that way. The evening passed in a blur of crackling firelight, melted marshmallows, and lazy conversation. Olivia queuing up songs on her speaker, Emma telling ghost stories between mouthfuls of candy, and me snapping Polaroids of the woods, the tent, the fire, little frozen moments to trap the night in something tangible. It was the kind of night that made the world feel safe, untouchable. The kind of night that lulled you into a false sense of security, right before everything changes. It started with the noises. At first, I barely noticed. Just a shift in the wind, the creak of something distant, the rustling of leaves beyond the firelight, easy enough to dismiss until it wasn't, until the sounds grew deliberate, measured, too controlled to be the wind, too slow to be an animal, and the moment stretched between us. That flicker of realization that none of us wanted to say out loud, that feeling of being watched, a presence just outside the glow of the fire, hidden between the trees. I turned and snapped a picture without thinking, the flash cutting through the darkness, illuminating nothing but branches and empty space. But even then, something in my gut told me we weren't alone. The air felt too heavy, the night too still, the silence thick like a held breath, waiting to exhale. By the time midnight rolled around, none of us wanted to sleep. The tent suddenly too small, too exposed, a flimsy barrier between us and whatever was lurking just beyond the trees. And when Olivia suggested exploring the barn to prove there was nothing to be afraid of, none of us said no, even though every instinct in me screamed to stay put. The barn loomed in the darkness, a skeletal frame of rotting wood and sagging beams, the doors hanging slightly open, as if someone had stepped inside and never returned. The air around it thick with the scent of dust and decay. As we moved closer, the noises intensified, the sound of something shifting, branches snapping underfoot. Not ours, something else, something just out of sight. And my fingers tightened around the Polaroid camera as I snapped another picture, the brief explosion of light revealing the peeling paint, the rusted hinges, and the gaping darkness beyond the doorway. Inside, the barn was worse, the silence unnatural, the air stale and unmoving, the floor littered with forgotten tools, broken furniture, and piles of burlap sacks slumped in the corners like abandoned bodies. The beams groaned above us, old wood settling, or at least that's what I wanted to believe. But then Emma pointed down, her breath hitching in her throat, and I saw them. Footprints. Fresh ones. The realization came slow, like my brain was refusing to accept what I was seeing. But there they were, deep impressions in the dust, leading toward the center of the barn, and then stopping, vanishing into nothing like whoever made them had just disappeared. The weight of the air shifted then, something pressing down on my chest, that awful, suffocating feeling of being watched, and before I could think, before I could react, a crash exploded from above. Something heavy slamming into the rafters, something moving. I looked up. For the briefest second, I saw it. Something shifting in the shadows. A figure. A shape. Something too fast, too dark, gone before I could register if it had even been there at all. But the sound of footsteps, rapid, deliberate, coming toward us, sent a surge of panic through my veins, and I was already moving, already grabbing Olivia's arm, already running before any of us could speak. The barn doors slammed behind us as we ran, our feet pounding against the dirt, breath ragged, lungs burning. But the second we reached the clearing, everything stopped, because our tent was gone. Not torn apart, not collapsed, just gone. As if it had never been there, as if we had never been there. The fire pit, nothing but a pile of neatly stacked logs, undisturbed, untouched, as though no one had ever built a fire at all. That was when I saw it. A single Polaroid, pinned to a tree with a rusted nail. my own handwriting scrawled across the white border, the picture I had taken earlier of the woods. But now, there was something new in the frame. 3 figures standing in the distance, half hidden in the trees, their faces nothing but smudges of darkness, staring straight ahead. The air seemed to close in around us then, the noises creeping back, no longer distant, no longer subtle, whispers threading through the leaves, footsteps shifting through the underbrush, and something else, something impossibly close. The distinct sensation of a hand brushing against my shoulder. Not the wind, not a branch. Something real. We ran. The path twisted and turned, the trees stretching taller, the shadows growing deeper, the feeling of something right behind us, always just a step too slow. The fear building in my chest like a scream I couldn't release. And by the time we reached the main house, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely breathe, barely think, barely function. But somehow, Olivia's key was in the lock. Somehow the door was swinging open. Somehow we were stumbling inside, slamming it shut behind us, pressing our backs against the wood like it was the only thing keeping the night out. And then, in the sudden, suffocating quiet, the flashlight beam caught something on the floor. More Polaroids. Scattered across the entryway, dozens of them, all taken from angles that shouldn't have been possible. Us sitting by the fire, us walking to the barn, us inside the barn staring at the footprints, and the last one, the one that made my skin go cold, the one that made me feel like the ground had disappeared beneath me. Us standing in the clearing, looking at the tree where the first Polaroid had been pinned. But now, there was something else, behind us. A figure, faceless, blurred, its mouth stretched into something that wasn't quite a smile. We didn't sleep that night. We stayed in the living room, every light on, jumping at every creak, every distant sound. Our minds trapped in the slow, suffocating crawl of morning. By sunrise, we were gone. Olivia never invited us back after that, never spoke about her father's land again. And Emma and I stopped asking, stopped trying to make sense of what had happened. But sometimes, when I can't sleep, I find myself reaching for the old Polaroids, staring at them under the pale glow of my bedside lamp, trying to convince myself that the figures in the shadows weren't really there, that the laughter I still hear in my dreams is just an echo of that night, that we left in time, that we weren't followed, and that whatever was out there, whatever had been watching us, never found its way inside. Camping alone had never scared me before. Not really. Not in the way it probably should have. Not in the way most people assumed it would. Because I had always known how to handle myself, how to pack smart, how to keep my head down, and disappear into the landscape when I needed to. How to move through the wilderness with quiet confidence, the way someone does when they trust the land more than they trust people. The woods had always been my retreat, my escape from the slow suffocation of city life, from the endless noise and restless crowds, from the feeling that everything was too close, too fast, too artificial. And so, when I pulled off the old service road that cut through the mountains and drove miles deeper than I probably should have, following the unmarked trails that only existed to people who knew where to look, I hadn't felt fear, hadn't questioned the silence, hadn't considered that maybe this time I had gone too far. The clearing was perfect, just wide enough for my truck and my small tent, surrounded on 3 sides by thick pines that stretched high into the fading sky. The tree line broken only by a steep drop-off that led down into a valley where the river cut through the rock, its distant rush barely audible beneath the weight of the wind moving through the trees. There was no sign that anyone had been here recently. No flattened grass, no leftover fire rings, no scraps of trash half buried in the dirt. And that was exactly how I liked it. Exactly what I had been searching for when I left town. The kind of place that felt untouched. as if the world had forgotten it existed. I moved through the familiar motions without thinking, setting up the tent, gathering wood, lighting a fire that crackled and popped as the flames took hold, chasing away the last traces of daylight as the shadows stretched long across the ground. The air was sharp with the scent of burning pine, the night settling in deep and quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against the skin, that makes the rest of the world feel distant, unreachable. I ate in silence, listening to the wind shift through the trees, watching embers drift up into the dark, letting the isolation sink into my bones in a way that was both comforting and absolute. And then, somewhere beyond the tree line, something moved. At first, it was nothing more than the soft rustle of leaves, the faint snap of a branch breaking underfoot, the kind of sound that could have belonged to any number of things. A deer, a coyote, something harmless, something expected. But as I sat there, my breath slow and measured, my body still and listening, I realized that whatever was out there wasn't moving like an animal, wasn't moving like something that belonged to this place. The steps were careful, slow, deliberate, a pattern too measured, too precise. The sound of weight shifting, pausing, listening, the kind of movement that belonged to someone who didn't want to be heard, someone who was trying to move unseen. A cold, sinking dread pooled low in my stomach, the instinctual kind, the kind that didn't come from panic or paranoia, but from something deeper, something primal, something that told me, without hesitation, that I wasn't alone anymore. The fire flickered, casting long shadows against the trees, and I forced myself to move slowly, deliberately, reaching for the rifle propped against the side of my tent, my fingers closing around the cool metal as I eased it into my lap, my grip steady, my breath controlled, waiting, watching. The steps stopped. The woods stretched silent. For a long moment, nothing moved, nothing changed, nothing made a sound, and then, a flash of light. A single, brief flicker deep between the trees, gone before I could fully register it, before my brain could decide whether it had been real or some trick of the firelight against the darkness. But I knew. I knew what I had seen, the unmistakable reflection of something metallic catching in the glow of the flames. Something small, something precise, something unmistakably man-made. A scope, a barrel, a gun. The next breath I took felt like glass in my throat, my body locked in place, my pulse hammering so hard I could feel it in my skull, my grip tightening around my own weapon as my mind ran through the possibilities, through the questions, through the scenarios that all led to the same conclusion, the same cold, undeniable truth. Whoever was out there wasn't hunting animals. The fire crackled, too loud, too exposed, the warmth of it suddenly suffocating, making my skin prickle, and I forced myself to move slowly, carefully, my fingers brushing over the spare rounds tucked into the pocket of my jacket, my mind already calculating how much time I had if I needed to use them, if I needed to run, if I even had the chance. And then, just beyond the light, something shifted. A figure. A shape barely distinguishable from the trees, just at the edge of the shadows, standing motionless, waiting, watching. The presence of it pressing against the space between us like something solid, something tangible, something suffocating. And then it spoke. Not loud, not rushed, not panicked, just a low, steady voice, the words so clear, so calm, that for a moment they almost didn't seem real. Put it down. The fire popped, embers drifting into the black sky. The only movement, the only sound, everything else frozen, trapped in that moment. In those words, in the certainty that whatever happened next, there was no turning back. I didn't lower the gun. I didn't speak. I didn't move. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure took a step back, disappearing into the trees, swallowed by the dark, the silence rushing in behind it, sealing it away like it had never been there at all. For a long time, I didn't breathe, didn't blink, didn't move a single muscle, waiting, listening, searching the darkness for any sign of movement, for any hint of what came next. But nothing came. Nothing changed. Nothing followed. The night stretched on. The fire burned lower. The woods remained still. But I never closed my eyes. And when the first trace of morning light bled into the sky, pale and weak against the endless black, I was already moving, already packing, already leaving, knowing, without a doubt, that whoever had been out there, whoever had been waiting, watching, speaking from the darkness, they had never really left. That's all for today, folks. If you like to see more of this creepy content, click on the video on screen.